Hello everybody, I'm alive, and back, at least for right now. Because as you may or may not know, there has been an election in the UK recently, and unlike some other places, this thankfully hasn't resulted in an angry mob turning up to the centre of capital, the parliamentary buildings, and causing millions of dollars in damages. And importantly for us, a change of government brings with it a change in Health Secretary. And the trope that often gets raised around this time is that Health Secretaries are a bit like Defence Against the Dark Arts teachers from Harry Potter, where you know that they'll probably turn out to be evil in some way, you just don't know exactly which flavour of evil they're going to turn out to be. But the question that many of us on the ground are asking is, what does this mean for doctors? For jobbing doctors of all grades, roles and experiences working throughout the NHS and the private sector, what does this mean for us? What might the next 5 years bring? What can we maybe look forward to? And what might we have to be fearful of? So let's start with the basics here. Wes Streeting is our new Health Secretary. He's the Labour MP for Ilford North and has been since 2015. He's widely considered to be on the right side of the spectrum within the Labour Party, pro-devolution and embracing of the use of the private sector, which is something that we'll go on to talk about more in a minute. But before we look at Wes in particular, let's take a step back and look at the Labour Party's manifesto for health, as now, at least in theory, they'll have to execute on some of it. And their health policy, as they set out last month, June 2024, tells us the following. 5 of the key steps that they've outlined include cutting the NHS waiting times with 40,000 more appointments available every week, doubling the number of cancer scanners, a new dentistry rescue plan, 8,500 additional mental health staff, and the return of the family doctor. Now, all of these things are obviously admirable, albeit somewhat superficial, because they have to be for a press release like this. The devil will be in the detail, what they actually execute and what their outcome measures are. How do you decide if they've been successful or not? If you want to read their manifesto in more detail, I've linked it and all the other sources for this video down in the video description. And if you want me to go through these points in much more detail, please let me know, because I can, and it might be a good use of time. But there are to my mind three major issues affecting doctors in the workforce today, and that's what this video is going to be about. These 3 things are, firstly, pay and conditions for work done. Number 2 is access to training and a medical career more broadly. And 3 is the growing use of non-doctors to do work that traditionally would have been done by doctors, including, but not limited to, the use of medical associate professionals such as physician associates and anaesthetic associates. So let's start firstly with pay and conditions. As you'll know, junior doctors, who are now formally called resident doctors in England and the rest of the UK, recently took to the streets of England for our 11th round of strike action since the beginning of the dispute under the previous Conservative government. There was some criticism of the timing of this action. Could it be seen as overly partisan around the change of government? What are you actually hoping to achieve? But for me, the major reason I supported this action was that it kept the issue of doctors' pay and conditions at the top of the political agenda throughout the changeover period. And ultimately, I think this was pretty successful. Wes Streeting told the press that the first call he made on being appointed would be to the Resident Doctors Committee to try and sort out the strike action, which is what happened. So congratulations as ever to Rob, Vivek and the rest of the Resident Doctors Committee for steering us through this position of uncertainty. Fundamentally, what doctors are asking for is for their years of relative pay cuts with respect to inflation to be restored back to normal, which had previously amounted to an estimate of about 35%. This doesn't have to come in one go, as has never been the demand at any time throughout the dispute, and it could come over several years, as again, which is always something that's been entertained. But Wes Streeting will be under very significant pressure from the Treasury and other central government to continue with austerity and cuts. The point that I want to make for doctors is that this changeover doesn't actually change anything in terms of our position. The demand for full pay restoration remains the same. We are being extremely vigilant over any other changes to terms, pay and conditions, and our strike mandate is still good for a long time. We will continue to strike as long as we need to. But there is the possibility now that the team on the other side of the table might actually show some interest in meeting us, unlike the previous sets of health secretaries who will tell the media one thing, that they're ready to get round the table at a moment's notice, but then refuse to do that, despite multiple invitations and the opportunity to get ACAS, the independent invigilators involved. But those previous health secretaries refused to come to the table despite multiple offers and invitations, but would then lie to the press about being ready to come to the table. So it was this circus that kept going round and round. What's important here is that that pressure is still on from the doctors. Strikes can be called at a moment's notice, and West Streeting and the Labour government know that. There's also an emphasis here on extra capacity, wanting to deliver 40,000 more appointments a week. And what I want to say here is that if there is work to be done, there is a known volume of work or capacity that you want to achieve, you have to be willing to pay people to do that work, as you would with anything. If it's within the same time period, so they've said more in a given week, that's practically going to mean more out of hours, evening and weekend work. What this in turn means is that you are asking people to give up this valuable extra time outside of core working hours. That is time that they could be spending with family, on hobbies, resting, relaxing on holiday, whatever it is that people want to do with their spare time, simply not being at work. You're asking them to spend more time at work than they were previously doing, with less time then being available to have mandatory rest after having done that work. For doctors, we already work 48 hours on average per week. There's only a limited amount of time that you can take. Our core rotas already include a lot of antisocial hours, including evenings and weekends, so wherever these extra hours that we don't already work are going to be pulled from, we need to be paid very well, especially because our marginal tax rates for doctors can be very high. You need to be willing to pay people really, really well up front in order, A, to get them to be willing to come to work and do extra hours, bearing in mind that they've already done more than an average working week, and then B, what you pay them needs to make that work valuable, because if someone is already on an effective 50%, 60%, 70% tax rate, it's simply not going to be worth it for them to come in and do extra hours. So basically, I hope Wes is willing and ready to pay people very, very well, and that's going to mean more than time and a half. The next big thing is access to training. Rachel Reeves, who is the previous Shadow Chancellor, has expressed this idea that Labour want to double the number of incoming medical student places from 7,500 per year to 15,000 per year. Now, this is one of those really crucial things that the general public has to understand about how health services work. More medical school places, that is the pathway that makes doctors, does not actually mean more doctors that can look after you, that can bring those waiting lists down, that can give you the specialist advice or the operations or the scans that you need. Medical school is only one very small part of that process, because the way it works is you do your medical degree, which is usually 5 or 6 years, then a couple of years of internship, what we call the foundation program, and only then, after this 6-8 year long process, does someone become ready to enter specialty training and become a GP, a haematologist, a cardiologist, a surgeon, whatever it is that you need. We already have a massive shortage of those specialty training posts, which enormously limits the number of people that can become any of those types of specialist doctors each year. The problem is actually worse than that, because there aren't enough jobs for people graduating from medical school to go into and get those basic internship years done, without which they can't even work as a doctor at all in or outside the NHS. You need at least the first year in order to achieve your full registration and license to practice. Every year we're having a last-minute scramble where hospitals are trying to make enough of these jobs ready for the number of doctors that are graduating, but the NHS is not able to guarantee that those jobs will continue to exist for the number of graduates we have at the moment, let alone if you want to double the number of medical students you're putting through. It's completely ridiculous. But the more major concern, like I said, is that for specialty training posts, without which you cannot train and become a specialist. Competition for these posts is going up and up and up and up, as much as 5, 10, 15, 20 applicants, that is doctors ready to work and train. The laptop's died, some ACG machines turned off. You have that many doctors applying for a single training post, which means that there are thousands and thousands of doctors who can't progress each year, that get stuck at this bottleneck place. And outside the NHS, outside of these training posts, they cannot progress. They are stuck. They cannot become more surgeons doing operations, more GPs to see you, more cardiologists to talk about your heart. This is a completely artificial bottleneck that's put in the way to avoid having to pay for more expensive senior doctors. This is a conscious political choice. But we have a two-pronged problem here. We are A, not training enough senior doctors to meet population demand. As our population becomes older, more comorbid, more complex, people have heart disease, diabetes, neurological disease, etc., they become more difficult to treat, so you need more senior decision makers to look after them, growing and more complex population demand. We also don't have enough training posts for doctors to actually go into anyway. So what that means is that there is demand in two places, from the population and from doctors, but the government is choosing not to address it and fundamentally not tell the public about it either. Training posts have to be expanded just to meet population demand. Even if you hate doctors, you don't have a choice about that. And we also need the capacity to do that. That means more trained educators, more surgical theatres, more trainees employed in hospital units to free up the other trainees to access training opportunities. You basically need massive infrastructure and capital investment in everything. Thirdly, the use of medical associate professionals and other non-doctors to supplant doctors and do the work that doctors were doing. This is a contentious hot topic, particularly at the moment, but from a governmental perspective, from what I think the Labour government may do, I don't think this trajectory will change at all, because it's not ever going to be in the Treasury's best interests to try and slow down the expansion of these other types of professional, because the whole point of them is to save the system money. And the GMC is also very unlikely to change anything given the enormous amount of power and money that it stands to gain once medical associate professionals are regulated under the GMC. We'll talk about this separately in another video, but the GMC is facing legal action on two fronts because of the way they're handling this issue. And all of the sides involved have come out swinging. As with the strikes, I think pressure from doctors on this issue is only going to continue to escalate. Royal colleges are now finally escalating after much pushback from their members. They are beginning to set out scope of practice documents for medical associate professionals at the national level. The Faculty of Physician Associates is formally separating from the Royal College of Physicians, the president of which has had to step down over all of this furore, and the issue is very much more in the public eye than it has ever been. From a Labour government perspective, do I think there will be interference with all of these processes? Yes, I do. And again, this is a wider point to discuss that could be talked about in another video, but because these roles were introduced, at least in part, as a cost-saving measure to reduce the reliance on locum doctors and substitute for medical professionals, and all of this has been documented and we have in writing, as Royal Colleges start to develop their specialty scope at a national level, after deciding if there is even a role at all for these other professionals in their specialties, that will bring the cost saving associated with them down. Nationally defined scope is going to be less cost saving than locally defined scope, because that allows much more flexibility over what work can be replaced and what can't. I think it's only logical to expect that we will see government interference in specialties trying to set out this scope. But obviously, given that doctors are the supervisors and ultimately carry the can, they can refuse to supervise in a way that they don't like. So what will happen amidst all of this, I don't know. But I don't think we're going to be out of the woods on this issue because of a Labour government at all, effectively. But that's what I think, guys. Those are the major issues that I think are affecting doctors at the moment, and what we might expect to see or not see under a new government. Thank you as ever for watching. Don't forget to like, rate, comment and subscribe. Let me know what you think. Are you excited, terrified of a new government? What do you think? Let me know. Take care, and I'll see you next time.